The shotgun barrel caught the afternoon light like a warning from God himself. Milton Slater had walked into plenty of tight spots across the territory's gambling dens in Abilene, border disputes down in El Paso, a cattle drive that went sideways somewhere north of the Pecos. But nothing had prepared him for this particular moment, standing in the doorway of what he had assumed, with every reasonable ounce of his frontier experience, was an empty homestead in the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1882. He had not expected the bees. He certainly had not expected her. She stood on the porch with the calm, unhurried authority of a woman who had never once in her life needed rescuing. Her dark auburn hair was pinned loosely beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat threaded with dried wildflowers, and she wore a canvas apron over her plain blue dress, both of them dusted with some fine pale substance that he would later understand was powdered sulfur. Her eyes were the color of creek water over dark stone, gray-green, and entirely unafraid. The shotgun in her hands was a double-barreled Remington, and she held it with the easy, practiced competence of someone who had used it before and would not hesitate to use it again. "You have about 3 seconds," she said, "to explain what you are doing inside my house before I introduce you to the second barrel. The first one I already put through a rattlesnake this morning, and I am feeling economical today." Milton Slater did not move. He had been called many things in his 31 years: reckless, stubborn, a man with a talent for finding trouble in places that looked peaceful, but he had never been called stupid. He kept his hands where she could see them and tried to remember exactly how he had arrived at this particular catastrophe. It had started, as most catastrophes did, with desperation. 3 weeks earlier, Milton had been riding southeast out of Santa Fe with $40 in his coat pocket, a horse named Copper that had seen better years, and a letter in his saddlebag from a man named Gerald Prout. Prout was a land speculator, the kind of man who wore clean shirts in dirty towns and smiled with every part of his face except his eyes. The letter had offered Milton a simple proposition: ride out to a homestead property in the Estancia Valley, assess its condition, and confirm that it was vacant and report back. Simple work. Survey work. The kind of thing a man did when his other options had run out. Milton had not asked too many questions about why Prout needed someone else to confirm a vacancy. He had needed the $40 more than he had needed answers. He had spent 2 weeks riding through country that grew more beautiful the further he went from civilization, great stretches of high desert grassland, the Manzano Mountains blue and jagged on the western horizon, the air so clean it almost hurt to breathe after the dust and stink of Santa Fe. He had camped by springs, caught fish in creek bottoms, watched thunderstorms build and break over the mountains with the kind of theatrical grandeur that made a man feel simultaneously insignificant and grateful to be alive. The homestead had appeared exactly where Prout's crude map indicated: a quarter section of land on the eastern slope of a long hill, sheltered from the north wind by a stand of pinon pines, watered by a reliable spring that fed a small pond before disappearing underground. The main house was a solid adobe structure, well built, with a proper roof and glass in the windows. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar built into the hillside, and 3 other smaller structures he could not immediately identify. He had circled the property twice from a respectful distance, watching for smoke, for movement, for any sign of habitation. The barn doors were closed. The shutters on the north side of the house were latched. The road leading up to the property had not been traveled recently, or so he had thought, until he realized later that the woman had a separate path she used that came up from the east, hidden by the curve of the hill and a deliberate planting of chamisa bushes. He had seen no horses in the corral. He had seen no laundry on the line. He had ridden up to the house, knocked, waited a full 2 minutes, knocked again, and when no answer came, he had done what any man in his position might have done. He had let himself in through the unlocked front door to take shelter from the afternoon heat and assess the interior. He had been inside approximately 7 minutes, long enough to note the neatly kept kitchen, the shelves of canned goods and dried herbs, the framed botanical drawings on the wall, the desk covered in handwritten notes that he did not touch, when he heard the boots on the porch. And then the door had opened, and Ruth Ramsey had stepped in from the afternoon sun, and Milton Slater's entire understanding of the situation had rearranged itself with violent and humiliating speed. "I am not a thief," he said now, his voice steady despite the gun. "My name is Milton Slater. I was hired to survey this property." Her expression did not change. "Hired by whom?" "A man named Gerald Prout, out of Santa Fe." Something moved through her face then, not fear exactly, but a sharpening, a gathering of attention that was more alarming in its way than the shotgun. She knew that name. "Put your hands behind your head," she said, "and step back against the wall. Not because I think you are lying, because I need to think, and I think better when men are not standing in my doorway." He did as she said. She lowered the shotgun a fraction, enough to indicate that she was willing to hear him out, not enough to suggest she had forgiven anything. "Gerald Prout," she repeated, as if tasting something bitter. "And he told you this land was vacant." "He told me it was likely vacant." "He wanted confirmation. And you believed him." "I had no reason not to." "You had every reason not to," she said quietly. "A man with a letter telling him to confirm a vacancy should ask himself who benefits from that confirmation. A man with half a brain should ask that before he rides 2 weeks into the territory on someone else's business." Milton felt the truth of that land on him like a stone. He had been asking himself the same thing for the last 30 seconds, with gathering and unpleasant urgency. "What does Prout want with your land?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, the shotgun still in her hands. Then she did something he had not expected. She sighed, and some of the combat went out of her posture, replaced by something older and more tired. "That," she said, "is a very long story, Mr. Slater. I have nowhere to be." Evidently. She set the shotgun against the wall beside the door within easy reach, he noted, and removed her hat. Her hair, loosened from that motion, fell partially around her shoulders, auburn and thick, and shot through with a single narrow streak of white above her left temple that he would later learn came from the day a swarm of 40,000 bees had decided to express their collective displeasure. "Sit down at the table. I will make coffee. And then you are going to tell me everything Gerald Prout said to you, and I will tell you what I know, and we will figure out together what kind of trouble we are both in." "We are both in," he said. "You rode out here on his errand, Mr. Slater. When he learns the land is occupied and you have spoken to me, do you imagine he will pay you that $40 and send you on your way?" Milton thought about Prout's smile. He thought about the 2 men he had seen waiting outside Prout's office, men with the specific, practiced stillness of people paid to do things that other people did not want to be publicly connected to. "No," he said, "I don't suppose he will." "Then sit down," said Ruth Ramsey, and went to put the kettle on. Her name was Ruth Eliza Ramsey, and she had been on this land for 4 years. She told him this while she ground coffee beans with an efficient, almost aggressive rhythm, and he sat at her kitchen table and watched her and tried to reorder everything he thought he knew about what he was doing out here in the Estancia Valley. She had come to New Mexico from Pennsylvania in 1878, the same year the Lincoln County War was burning its way through the territory 50 miles to the south. She had come with her husband, a botanist and naturalist named Thomas Ramsey, who had believed, with the passionate conviction of an educated man who had not yet been tested by the actual land, that the high desert of New Mexico was the future of American scientific agriculture. He had been right about the land's potential. He had not been right about his own constitution. He had taken fever in the winter of 1879 and been dead by February of 1880, leaving Ruth with a quarter section of homesteaded land, $112 in cash, his library, his tools, his notebooks, and a practical education in beekeeping that he had insisted they both undertake in the summer of their first year because, he said, every sustainable homestead needed pollinators. He was right about the bees, Ruth said, setting a mug of coffee in front of Milton with the directness of a woman who did not perform hospitality but simply provided it. He was right about most things, actually, just not about surviving. Milton wrapped his hands around the mug. I am sorry for your loss, he said, and meant it in the simple, uncomplicated way that he meant most things. It was 2 years ago, she said. I have made my peace with it. She sat down across from him with her own coffee and looked at him with those gray-green eyes that made him feel uncomfortably that she was reading something written on the inside of his skull. Now, Gerald Prout. He told her everything. He was not a man given to secrets by nature. His particular talent was a kind of blunt honesty that had gotten him into trouble almost as often as it had gotten him out of it. And there was something about the directness of her attention that made concealment feel not just pointless but somehow disrespectful. He told her about the letter, the $40, the crude map, the instruction to confirm vacancy and report back. He told her about the 2 men outside the office. She listened without interrupting, her hands around her mug, her face very still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Gerald Prout has been trying to acquire this land for 18 months. He began with an offer, a fair one, I suppose, by his lights, though not by mine. I declined. Then he sent a territorial lawyer who informed me that Thomas's original homestead filing had a procedural defect and might not be legally sound. I hired my own lawyer, a woman. Don't look so surprised, Mr. Slater. There are women lawyers, particularly in territories that need warm bodies with legal training, and she established that the filing was perfectly sound. Then Prout's men came out here twice, and both times I encouraged them to leave. With the Remington, with information, she said. The first time. The second time, yes, also with the Remington. Milton thought about the 2 encounters and found he was not surprised by either outcome. What does he want with your land specifically? There are plenty of quarter sections out here that aren't occupied. This land has water, she said simply. The spring never fails. Not in drought years, not in hard winters. Thomas chose it very carefully. And Prout is buying up everything within 10 miles of the planned railroad extension through the valley. Whoever controls the water controls the development. He has already acquired 3 other properties by various means. She paused. The family on the Delgado place left after their cattle were poisoned. The widow Hutchins sold for 1/3 of market value after a suspicious fire took her barn. I have been waiting to see what approach he would try next. And now he has tried me, Milton said. He tried to use you, she said, with a precision that he found both correct and slightly uncomfortable. There is a difference. You are not his man, Mr. Slater, unless you are. I am not, he said. I did not know what I was riding into. No, she agreed, studying him. I believe that. You do not have the look of a man with hidden motives. You have the look of a man who took a job without asking enough questions, which is different and considerably more forgivable. She tilted her head slightly. What were you doing in Santa Fe that left you needing $40 badly enough to take a job from a man like Prout? He looked at his coffee. Lost a horse to lameness outside of Albuquerque. Had to sell my other horse to pay for lodging and food while I waited for Copper to recover. Copper, that's the brown out in your front yard eating your grass, for which I apologize. Copper is sound now. But I was down to my last few dollars and Prout's offer came at the right moment. A drifting man, she said, not unkindly. Where are you from originally? Texas originally, West Texas near the Guadalupe Mountains. He paused. I have not been back in 6 years. She did not ask why. He appreciated that and noted it. Well, she said, and looked out the window at the late afternoon light going gold over her land. Here is the situation as I understand it. Prout now expects a report from you confirming vacancy. If you report to him that the property is occupied and the owner is in residence and intends to stay, he will send someone else, someone with less scruple and more instruction. If you disappear, If you simply ride away from this situation, he may draw his own conclusions, but he will certainly send those men I saw outside his office eventually regardless." She turned back to Milton. "And if you stay here, you become a problem for him in a different way." "What kind of a different way?" Milton said. Ruth Ramsey looked at him steadily. "A witness," she said, "to whatever he tries next, and possibly a deterrent if you are willing to be one." The evening came on slowly, the way evenings did in that high desert country, all long horizontal light and the smell of sage and the distant sound of coyotes beginning their nightly commentary on the state of the world. Ruth showed Milton where to put copper in the barn. She had a mule named Augustine and 3 laying hens and a spotted dog named Geometry, and the barn was clean and well organized in the way of a person who understood that disorder was expensive, and she pointed him toward the lean-to shed at the back of the barn where she kept extra blankets. "You can sleep there," she said. "I will not have you in the house. Not yet." "Not yet," he repeated. "I am not naive, Mr. Slater. You are a stranger who entered my home uninvited. That you had reasonable, if manipulated, motives does not make you a known quantity. We will see what we are dealing with before I decide how much to trust you." "That is entirely fair," he said, and meant it. She nodded once crisply, as if a minor negotiation had been concluded, and went back inside. He lay in the lean-to that night and listened to the darkness, and thought about secrets and traps and the particular kind of forced choice that life occasionally presented to a man who had been drifting long enough to lose track of what he was drifting toward. He thought about Gerald Pruitt's smile and the 2 quiet men outside the office in Santa Fe. He thought about the widow Hutchins's burned barn and the Delgado family's poisoned cattle. And then, because he could not help it, he thought about Ruth Ramsey standing in her doorway with that shotgun, the afternoon light behind her, entirely unafraid. He had known many women in his 31 years. He had been fond of several of them, but he had never encountered anything quite like the quality of attention she brought to everything she looked at, as if the world were a problem worth taking seriously, and she had both the patience and the capability to solve it. He slept badly and in the morning felt oddly hopeful anyway. She was already up when he emerged at dawn, out among the hives. There were 14 of them, he would learn the exact number later, arranged in 2 rows on the south-facing slope behind the house, painted white and weathered to a gentle gray-white by 2 years of high desert sun. Ruth moved among them with an unhurried, deliberate ease, wearing a canvas jacket and the wide-brimmed hat. She had no veil, no gloves. She carried a smoker, a small tin bellows device that produced a thin stream of cool smoke, and she used it with the same quiet authority she brought to everything. A small puff here, a small puff there, communicating something to the bees in a language he did not understand, but she clearly did. He watched from a distance because he was not invited, and because some instinct told him that her space among the hives was not a place to intrude without permission. He was also, he would admit privately, uncertain about the bees. He had no particular fear of them, but 40,000 of them, or however many she had, multiplied across 14 hives, represented a quantity of stinging insects that commanded a certain respect. She noticed him after a few minutes. "Come here," she said without turning around. "Slowly, do not wave your arms or make sudden movements. Do not swat if one lands on you." He walked to her slowly. Up close, the hives were remarkable. The bees moved in and out of the small entrance holes at the base of each box with the purposeful, organized efficiency of a well-run enterprise, which is exactly what it was. The sound of them, a deep, warm, continuous hum that he felt as much as heard, was both unnerving and unexpectedly beautiful, like standing next to a river in flood. "Hold out your hand," Ruth said. He did. She tilted the smoker and gave his wrist a small puff, then did the same to his neck and the back of his other hand. "Smoke calms them," she said. "It mimics the signal their bodies release when they detect danger. A calm hive is a predictable hive." She looked at him sideways. "That is a principle that applies beyond beekeeping." A bee landed on his forearm. He kept very still. It walked in a small exploratory circle, then flew away. "What are you checking?" he asked. "Spring inspection. I need to see how the colonies came through winter, assess the queen's laying pattern, check for signs of American foul brood and varroa mites. Healthy colonies need surveillance. Problems caught early can be addressed. Problems ignored become catastrophes." She opened a hive with a tool he would learn was called a hive tool, a small flat metal implement for prying apart frames, and lifted out a frame covered in bees and honeycomb. She held it up to the light with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Milton looked at the frame. It was extraordinary, in the way that things made by 10,000 small creatures working in perfect coordination are always extraordinary. The hexagonal cells were flawless, each one perfectly sized, the honey in them catching the morning light like amber glass. "Healthy laying pattern," Ruth said, pointing to a section of the frame where he could see small white crescents in the bottom of some cells. "Eggs, the queen is active and the pattern is consistent. This colony wintered well." She slid the frame back with practiced care. "This one will need a super added an additional box before June or they will swarm." "What happens if they swarm?" "They leave. Half the colony follows a new queen to find a new home, and you lose half your bees, which is half your honey production and half your pollination capacity." She looked at him. "It is the bees' way of reproducing at the colony level, entirely natural, also for my purposes something to be managed. You speak about them like they are individuals. Each one is. And each colony has its own character. That one," she indicated a hive at the end of the row, "is aggressive. I keep it at the end and I am more careful with it. It produces twice the honey of any other hive, and it will sting you if you look at it wrong. The one beside my front door is gentle as a spring morning and moderately productive. I named that one Thomas." Milton was quiet for a moment. "After your husband. He picked the spot for it," she said simply. "He spent the morning helping where he could, carrying frames she asked him to carry, holding equipment, staying out of the way when she indicated he should stay out of the way, which was often. She was not unkind in her direction of him, simply efficient, and he found he did not mind being directed by a woman who knew what she was doing in the way that he would have minded being directed by someone who did not. Competence was its own authority, in his experience. Over the next several days, the rhythms of the homestead began to reveal themselves to him, and he began to see what Ruth Ramsey had built here in 4 years of solitary, determined work. The 3 smaller structures behind the main house were a dedicated honey house, where she extracted, filtered, and bottled honey using a hand-cranked extractor she had ordered from a supplier in Chicago and transported in pieces from Albuquerque. A wax workshop, where she processed beeswax into blocks that she sold to a chandler in Santa Fe, and a small greenhouse structure, currently full of started seedlings for the kitchen garden. She kept meticulous records, notebooks full of observation data on each colony, whether records going back 4 years, accounts of honey production by hive and by month, records of sales to customers in Estancia and Santa Fe and as far away as Albuquerque. She had, he discovered gradually, a business. A small but real and self-sustaining business built on the labor of her bees and her own intelligence, and her refusal to give up when the easier choice would have been to sell and go back east. "How much honey do you produce in a season?" he asked one evening when she was going over her accounts at the desk, and he was mending a section of fence post that had rotted working because he could not in good conscience simply eat her food and sleep in her barn without contributing something. "In a good year, approximately 800 pounds, she said, without looking up from her numbers. "I sell most of it, keep enough for my own use through winter. The wax is a smaller income but more consistent. Chandlers need it year-round. The two together are enough to pay the property taxes, maintain the equipment, buy what I cannot grow or make myself, and put something aside. That is a considerable operation for one person." "Yes," she said, "it is," and she returned to her accounts in a way that made clear she had not built it to be impressive, only because it needed to be built. He thought about Prout, sitting in his clean office in Santa Fe, looking at maps and calculating water rights and railroad access, and he felt a hot, specific anger that surprised him with its intensity. Not just at the injustice of what Prout was trying to do, though that was real, but at the particular blindness of a man like Prout, who could look at what Ruth Ramsey had built and see only an obstacle to be removed. On the 5th day, he saddled Copper and rode to the town of Estancia. He had told Ruth he was going, and she had looked at him with those measuring eyes and said, "I trust you to use your judgment," which was not the same as saying she trusted him, but was considerably more than she had offered when she first held that shotgun on him, and he found he wanted, with an urgency that was new to him, to be worthy of that measured, provisional trust. Estancia was a small town of perhaps 300 people at that point in 1882, with a general store, a post office, a saloon, a livery stable, a church, and the assorted human accumulation that gathered wherever a railroad survey had recently passed, and people were betting their futures on where the tracks would eventually land. Milton spent an hour at the general store buying supplies he paid for with his own remaining money, listening to conversations, and establishing himself as a traveler passing through. Then he spent another hour in the saloon nursing a single beer and listening harder. What he heard confirmed what Ruth had told him, and added details that darkened the picture considerably. Gerald Prout had a representative in Estancia, a local land agent named Corbett who made his living facilitating Prout's acquisitions and who was, according to the overheard conversation of two men who were either drunk enough to be careless or who simply did not care about being overheard, expecting some kind of report in the next week that would settle the question of the Ramsey property once and for all. Once and for all. Those were the words. Milton turned them over in his mind and did not like what they implied. He also stopped at the post office and sent a telegram to a man named James Farwell in Santa Fe, a territorial land office official he had met 3 years ago and done an honest turn for, the kind of small favor that a man of modest means performed without expectation of return, but that sometimes, years later, turned out to matter. The telegram was careful and factual: a named property in the Estancia Valley, a homesteaded quarter section, legal questions regarding water rights, and a pattern of pressure against the occupant. Could Farwell make inquiries through official channels? He rode back to the homestead in the late afternoon, and Ruth was at the honey house when he arrived, running extracted frames through the filter. The smell of warm honey met him at the door, rich and complex and entirely unlike anything else in the world. She listened to his report without interrupting. When he finished, she stood at her filter tank for a moment, then said, "Once and for all, yes, I thought it would come to something like this." "What do you want to do?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and he was struck again by the quality of her attention, the sense that she was thinking 3 moves ahead of the conversation, calculating probabilities the way a chess player calculated board positions. "What is the most likely method?" she said. "If Prout's man in Estancia is expecting a decisive outcome." "Legal maneuver or direct action," Milton said. "Legal maneuver takes longer and leaves a record. Direct action is faster and deniable." He paused. "I think he will send those 2 men from his office, and I think they will arrive before the week is out. Then we need to be ready," Ruth said, "and we need the law. I sent a telegram to a contact in Santa Fe." She looked at him with something that shifted almost imperceptibly toward warmth, a barely detectable change in the lines around her eyes. "That was well done, Mr. Slater." "Milton," he said, "given the circumstances, I think we might manage first names." She considered this with slightly more gravity than the suggestion warranted, and then said, "Ruth," and went back to her filtering. She prepared for potential trouble the way she prepared for everything, with methodical, unsentimental efficiency. She knew her land with the intimacy of 4 years of daily attention, and she used that knowledge. She cleared sightlines, identified defensible positions, and made a detailed inventory of every useful thing she had. She was not preparing for war. She was preparing to make it clear, in whatever language proved necessary, that this land was occupied and its owner was not leaving. Milton helped. He repaired the fence on the north side of the property where 3 posts had rotted completely, not because a fence would stop determined men, but because a maintained property signaled an occupied one, and signaling mattered. He cleared brush from around the barn. He checked the water system from the spring to the house, repaired a section of pipe that had developed a slow leak, and ensured that the water flow was reliable. On the 3rd evening of what he was privately calling the waiting period, Ruth came out to the barn as he was finishing with Copper's evening grooming, and she sat on a hay bale and watched him work, and after a while she said, "Why did you stay?" He went on brushing Copper in the long, steady strokes that the horse liked. "Because it was the right thing to do." That is not an answer. Plenty of men know what the right thing to do is and do not do it. He thought about that for a moment. "Because I wanted to," he said then. "Because this place is worth staying for. Because what Prude is doing is wrong and someone should do something about it." He paused. "Because I have been drifting for 6 years and I am tired of it, and the first place I have been in 6 years that felt like somewhere I might want to be is your homestead, which is an awkward thing to admit to a woman who had a gun on me 4 days ago." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you leave Texas?" she asked. He had known the question was coming, from the moment he had mentioned West Texas and then failed to explain. He had been waiting for her to ask it, braced for it the way a man braces for a difficult medical examination, knowing it is necessary, not welcoming the discomfort. "My father had a ranch," he said. "I worked it from the time I was old enough to sit a horse. When he died, I was 23. I expected to take it over. Instead, I discovered he had debts he had never told anyone about, mortgaged to a bank in El Paso to the point where the property was essentially already the bank's. They gave me 3 months to pay the deficit. I could not pay it." He set down the brush. "I watched the ranch sold at auction to a man from Ohio who had never ridden a horse. And then I left because I could not stay and watch it become something else, and I have been moving ever since." Ruth looked at him steadily. "A hidden burden," she said, "carried a long way." "Yes." He leaned against the stall wall, the horse warm at his shoulder. "So I know something about what it costs to lose land you built something on. And I know what kind of man waits until someone is vulnerable to try to take what belongs to them." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Thomas would have liked you." And before he could respond to that, she stood and said, "I am making dinner. Come in when you are done." It was the first time she had said that without adding the qualifier about it not being a habit. The moment that changed everything between them. The moment that he would return to again and again in memory, trying to understand exactly how a hard and careful woman had dismantled the defenses of a man who had been moving too fast for 6 years to let anything catch up with him, came on a warm afternoon 9 days after his arrival. He had been fixing a section of the honey house roof, which had developed a small gap that would let rain in over the summer, and he was up on the roof with a hammer and some cedar shingles when he heard the hive at the end of the row, the aggressive one, the one Ruth called difficult, erupt. The sound was different from the colony's usual drone. It rose in pitch and volume suddenly, dramatically, the kind of sound that sent a primitive signal straight to the back of a man's brain. Milton was off the roof in seconds and came around the corner of the honey house to see 3 things simultaneously. A large dog, a stray, by its thin and undirected look nosing at the base of the hive, the colony boiling out of the entrance in a dark, angry cloud, and Ruth running from the house toward the hives, still pulling on her jacket. "Get back!" he shouted and started toward the dog, thinking to drive it away from the hive before the situation worsened. "Milton, stop!" Ruth's voice was sharp and absolute. "Do not run. Slow walk to the barn and get the smoker. It is hanging just inside the left door. Go slowly." He stopped. He did not run. He walked to the barn with deliberate, measured steps that took enormous willpower with the sound of 10,000 furious bees behind him, retrieved the smoker from its hook, and walked back. Ruth had already reached the hive, moving through the agitated cloud of bees with a stillness so complete that she might have been a standing stone. She was speaking in a low, continuous murmur that he could not quite hear, but that seemed, impossibly, to be making some impression on the surrounding cloud. The dog had fled. Presumably, the bees had made their position clear. Ruth took the smoker from him and began working it, slow puffs, slow movement, her body language entirely calm despite the fact that she was surrounded by a living cyclone of insects. The cloud began, gradually, to coalesce, to draw back. Individual bees returned to the hive. The sound dropped by degrees from alarm to something closer to irritation, and then to the deep, working hum of a colony reassessing its situation. When it was over, perhaps 10 minutes in total, though it had felt much longer, Ruth pulled off her hat and exhaled, and Milton saw that her hands were shaking slightly, the only outward sign that any of it had cost her anything. She had, he counted later, 3 stings. One on the back of her neck, one on the side of her hand, one on her forearm. She treated them herself with a paste made from baking soda and water with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had done it many times. That was remarkable, he said. He had intended to say something more composed than that, but it was what came out, simple and honest. She looked up from her arm. It was beekeeping. It was not, he said. I have seen a lot of people do a lot of things in a lot of hard places. That was something else. You walked into the middle of 10,000 panicked bees and you talked them down. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. I did not talk them down, I gave them information. Smoke tells them that something has triggered their honey protection response and that they should prepare to evacuate rather than defend. It resets the signal. Once the signal resets, their behavior shifts. She paused. They are not acting on rage. They are acting on information. Change the information, change the behavior. Like people, he said. Like most things, she agreed. He looked at her. This woman standing in the New Mexico afternoon with bee stings on her neck and hand, and a container of baking soda paste, her hair loose and her expression thoughtful, discussing the neurology of colonial insect behavior with the calm authority of a professor who happened to also run a working honey operation in a territory where most people did not yet know her name. And he felt something in his chest that had been moving for days finally arrive at its destination. He was, he understood, thoroughly and completely lost on Ruth Ramsey. And he had no idea what to do about it, except to stay and to be useful, and to not do anything stupid, all of which was going to require more discipline than he was accustomed to exercising. The men from Santa Fe arrived on a Tuesday. There were 3 of them, not 2, which either meant Prout had taken the possibility of resistance more seriously than expected, or that Milton's continued absence had altered his calculations. They rode in from the road at mid-morning, which was either confidence or carelessness. A person trying to be subtle would have come after dark. Milton saw them from the barn roof, which he had taken to checking each morning from a scouting habit, and he came down and went to the house and knocked. Ruth opened the door before he could knock a second time. She had already seen them. She stood in the doorway with the Remington in her hand, not raised but present. 3, Milton said. I counted 3, she confirmed. Do you want me out front or at the side of the house? She glanced at him. Front, to my right, visible, not concealed. He understood the strategy immediately. Concealment suggested preparation for ambush. A visible presence was a deterrent. It changed the information the approaching men were receiving, the same principle as the smoker and the bees. He stood where she indicated in the morning sun, his own hands at his sides. He was not wearing his gun. They had discussed that too, briefly, the night before, when they had agreed that the goal was documentation and deterrence, not confrontation. The 3 men came up the road and stopped their horses 10 yards from the porch. The man in the center was Corbett, the land agent from Estancia, whom Milton recognized from his description. He had the specific air of a man who spent most of his time in the middle, not the person who gave orders and not the person who carried them out physically, but the person who arranged for both, which in some ways made him the most dangerous. Beside him were two men who confirmed Milton's assessment from the Santa Fe office, still, watchful, with the practiced blankness of professional intimidation. "Mrs. Ramsey," Corbett said, pleasantly, as if this were a social call. "I represent Mr. Gerald Prout, with whom I believe you are acquainted. Mr. Prout has asked me to convey his renewed interest in acquiring your property and to present you with an updated offer." "Mr. Prout's offer is not something I am interested in hearing," Ruth said with perfect, even courtesy. "This is my land, filed legally under the Homestead Act of 1862, improved and occupied continuously since 1878. Nothing about that situation has changed." Corbett's pleasantness acquired an edge. "Mrs. Ramsey, there are questions about the legal soundness of the original filing those questions were addressed and settled in territorial court 14 months ago," Ruth said. "The judge's finding is a matter of public record. If Mr. Prout's legal team is unaware of that, they are either incompetent or dishonest, and you can tell him I said so." She paused. "Also, I have sent documentation of this conversation, and the pattern of pressure Mr. Prout has applied to this property to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. A contact there is already making inquiries. If anything were to happen to this property or to myself, that documentation would be the first thing the Territorial Marshal would read." Corbett's pleasantness evaporated. One of the two men shifted his horse slightly, and Milton moved not threateningly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Just enough to remind the man that he was there and that the geometry of the situation included him. "This is your final answer," Corbett said. "This is the only answer I have ever had," Ruth said. "I suggest you convey it clearly." There was a long moment in which Milton felt the situation balanced on a point, the way a coin balanced on its edge before gravity made the decision. Then Corbett pulled his horse's head around and rode back down the road, and his two companions followed without a word, which told Milton that the instruction had been to assess and report, not to escalate. Not yet, anyway. Ruth watched them go until they were out of sight. Then she set the Remington against the door frame and sat down on the porch step and pressed both hands flat on her thighs, and Milton saw that she was doing the same thing she had done after the bees, breathing through the aftermath, managing the cost of holding very still through something that had required considerable effort. He sat down on the step beside her, not close enough to presume, close enough to be present. "You did that very well," he said. "I practiced the speech 3 times yesterday evening after you went to the barn." He looked at her. "You practiced it. Preparation reduces the effect of fear," she said. "I was not fearless. I was prepared." She exhaled slowly. "Do you think they will come back?" "Corbett won't," Milton said. "He is not a man who risks himself directly. Prout may send someone else, or he may decide the risk of official scrutiny isn't worth the water rights." He thought about it. The telegram to Farwell was important. If Farwell's inquiries produce official attention, Prout becomes exposed. He operates on the assumption that small operators in remote territories have no access to institutional power. Your documentation and my contact changes that equation. Ruth turned to look at him, and this time the thing that moved through her face was something fuller than what he had seen before. "I have been managing this alone for 18 months, she said. "It has been manageable, but it has also been," she paused, selecting the word carefully, "isolating. To have someone else who understands the whole picture and who is willing to," she stopped again. "Stay," he said quietly. "You keep doing that," she said, finishing the sentence in the direction I was afraid to take it. "Is it the wrong direction?" She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he was aware of the morning light on her face and the warm, constant smell of honey and sage, and the way the distant mountains held the horizon like a promise made before anyone was born to receive it. "No," she said. "It is not the wrong direction." She did not invite him to hold her hand. She did not lean toward him. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer than was entirely businesslike, and then she stood and went inside to make coffee, and he sat on the porch in the warm morning and felt the particular, terrifying happiness of a man who has just realized that something is beginning. A response came from James Farwell in Santa Fe 11 days later, a letter rather than a telegram, which meant it was detailed. Farwell confirmed that he had opened an inquiry into the pattern of land acquisition in the Estancia Valley area attributed to Gerald Pruitt. He had found 3 additional complaints, previously unregistered, from families who had sold under what they now described as coercive circumstances. He had referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office and to the U.S. Land Office. He expected that Pruitt would receive official correspondence within the month. He also included a personal note at the bottom of the official letter. Milton, I do not know what situation you have stumbled into, but the woman you are helping has more legal standing than she perhaps realizes. Her original filing is airtight. Her documentation of the harassment is thorough and professionally maintained. If she is willing to serve as a primary complainant in a formal proceeding, she has a strong case. I would advise her to get a territorial lawyer. There is a good one in Albuquerque, not the one Pruitt uses. Ruth read the letter twice. She sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "He has them." "Farwell thinks so," Milton said. "I want to pursue the formal complaint," she said. "I want this on record. I want it to be impossible for Pruitt to do to the next family what he has done to the Delgados and the Hutchins widow, regardless of what happens with my property." "I know," Milton said. "You knew I would say that." "Yes." She looked up from the letter. "Why?" "Because," he said, "you are not the kind of person who stops at protecting herself when she can protect someone else too." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I need to go to Albuquerque." "I know that too. Will you come?" She asked it with the directness she brought to everything, and he heard in it, beneath the practical question, the thing she was not yet saying in plain words, the thing that they had both been quietly building toward for the better part of 3 weeks. "I will come," he said. "Yes." They rode to Albuquerque together the following week, leaving Augustine the mule in the care of a neighboring family 2 miles east, the Torres family, who had lived in the valley for 3 generations, and who regarded Pruitt's activities with the specific, quiet fury of people who had watched their land, and their neighbor's land become a commercial calculation. The ride was 3 days. They made camp at night, which was not remarkable. The territory between Estancia and Albuquerque was well-traveled and reasonably safe in 1882. And they were 2 adults with a Remington shotgun and Milton's Colt revolver, and between them sufficient frontier competence to make themselves comfortable in the open. But there was something in the traveling together, the rhythm of it, the easy division of tasks, the way conversation moved between them with none of the careful management that social interaction usually required, that was, Milton thought, one of the more purely pleasant experiences of his adult life. Ruth talked about bees in a way that made him want to learn everything she knew. She talked about Thomas sometimes, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of clear-eyed love that did not require anything from him. The way you talked about a landscape you had loved and left honestly, without pretending you had not loved it, without pretending the leaving had not been painful, without letting it become the only landscape you could see. He talked about West Texas. It was the first time in 6 years he had talked about it freely, and he found that the talking, with her listening, made it feel like something he could carry rather than something that was carrying him. On the second night they made camp by a small stream, and the temperature dropped more than expected, and they sat closer to the fire than they would have otherwise. And at some point the conversation had shifted into something quieter and more careful, the kind of talking that happens near the edge of something significant. "What do you intend to do," she said, "after Albuquerque?" "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On what happens in Albuquerque, and after." She poked at the fire with a stick. "And if things go well, if Farwell's inquiry comes through and Pruitt is backed down and the formal complaint is filed, then you will not need a deterrent anymore," he said, "or a witness." "No," she agreed, "I will not need those things." "Will you need anything else?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled between them and the stream talked to itself in the darkness, and somewhere out in the sage an owl was conducting its nightly surveillance. "Thomas used to say," she said slowly, "that the hardest thing he learned from the bees was the difference between a colony that was surviving and a colony that was thriving. A surviving colony has enough. A thriving colony has enough and is also growing and is also contributing to the ecology around it." She paused. "I have been surviving well, very well on my own terms. I have made something I am proud of. But," Milton said softly, "but I have been thinking," she said, with the care of a person who thinks before she speaks and knows what she is saying, "about thriving." The fire spoke between them for a moment. "Ruth," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it has been 3 weeks. I know I held a gun on you. I know practically everything about this is absurd and fast, and I am a woman of 40 years old with a bee operation and a 4-year-old homestead and no patience for foolishness." 40, he said. "I would have said 33. She gave him a look that was not quite a glare but was related to one. "The point I am making, Mr. Slater, is that I am aware of how this looks. And I am making it anyway because I have learned that doing things because they are conventional is a very poor substitute for doing things because they are right. Ruth," he said again, more quietly, "I am 31 years old and I have been on the road for 6 years, and I have not in all that time found a single place that felt like it wanted me to stay. Your homestead felt like that the second morning I was there." He held her gaze across the fire. "I am not suggesting anything reckless. I am suggesting that whatever comes after Albuquerque, I would like to be around for it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I would like that too," she said, "very much." They did not touch that night. They sat by the fire and talked until the fire burned low, and then they rolled out their blankets on opposite sides of the remains and went to sleep. And in the morning they made coffee and broke camp with the easy, efficient rhythm of people who have already established how to exist in the same space, and rode on toward Albuquerque with the mountains on their left hand and the wide sky over them. And Milton felt that the world had become, overnight, a considerably more interesting place to inhabit. Albuquerque in 1882 was a city in the process of becoming something larger than it had been, courtesy of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which had arrived the year before and brought with it the particular catalytic energy of commercial ambition. The new town had grown up alongside the railroad depot, a somewhat chaotic collection of hotels, stores, saloons, and professional offices that existed in interesting tension with the older Hispanic settlement of the same name, a mile to the west. The lawyer Farwell had recommended was a man named Cornelius Brand, mid-40s, precise in manner and speech, with a reputation for taking cases that were legally solid and morally clear and pursuing them with a tenacity that opposing counsel apparently found exhausting. He had, his secretary informed them while they waited, won 71% of his cases in the last 5 years, which Ruth noted was considerably better than the base rate and indicated systematic competence rather than luck. Brand met with them for 3 hours. He read every document Ruth had brought, the original filing, the court record from the legal challenge 14 months ago, the letter from her own lawyer at the time, the documentation she had maintained of every instance of pressure and contact from Prout or his representatives, and now Farwell's letter. When he finished reading, he put down the last paper and looked at Ruth over his reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Ramsey, I will tell you honestly that I have seen perhaps a dozen cases with this specific pattern in the last 3 years. A speculator with capital and territorial connections, attempting to clear out small homesteaders in the path of railroad development. Most of those cases ended in the speculator's favor because the homesteaders did not have what you have. Which is," Ruth said, "impeccable documentation, a clear legal record, an existing official inquiry through the land office, and a witness who is not employed by or connected to you." He nodded toward Milton. Your account of being engaged by Prout and subsequently finding the property occupied, Mr. Slater, that is significant. It establishes intent and establishes the method. They stayed in Albuquerque for 4 days. Brand filed papers. They gave sworn statements before a territorial notary. They met twice more with Brand to review and expand the complaint. By the time they were done, Gerald Prout of Santa Fe had a formal legal proceeding against his business practices that would require his full attention and considerable expense for the better part of a year, and the likelihood of his acquiring Ruth's property by any means, legal or otherwise, had dropped from a genuine threat to a remote possibility. Brand also advised a practical precaution. He filed an additional protective notice with the Territorial Land Office, specifically flagging the Ramsey property as the subject of an active protective inquiry, which would make any transfer attempts or legal challenges immediately visible to official scrutiny. When they came out of Brand's office into the Albuquerque afternoon on their final day in the city, Ruth stood on the board sidewalk for a moment and turned her face up to the sky with her eyes closed, and Milton watched the tension that had lived in her shoulders for 18 months, perhaps longer, perhaps since Thomas died and she had understood that she was going to be doing all of this alone. He watched it, very slowly, release. He did not say anything. He simply stood beside her in the afternoon sun. After a moment she opened her eyes and looked at him sideways. "Brand is going to win," she said. It was not a question. "Brand is going to win," Milton agreed. "Prout is going to be very unhappy." "Yes." "Good," said Ruth Ramsey, and the word came out with a quiet, fierce satisfaction that made him want to laugh, and he did laugh. And after a moment she laughed too, and they stood on the sidewalk in Albuquerque laughing at the plain relief of it. And 2 people passing by looked at them with the puzzled warmth of strangers recognizing joy without knowing its cause. They bought 2 good dinners that evening at a hotel restaurant that had tablecloths and decent wine, and they talked for 3 hours and ate without hurrying. And when they walked back through the streets of the new town in the warm dark, Milton took her hand and she did not pull it away. The ride home took 3 days again, the same country, the same camps, but different. The previous journey had been purposeful in the way of people moving toward something necessary. This journey was quieter and warmer, the way of people who have resolved a necessary thing and are now free to attend to other things. On the first night, by the same stream where they had talked near the fire, he kissed her. Or perhaps she kissed him. Later, he would maintain the former and she would maintain the latter, and the disagreement would become one of the small recurring pleasures of their life together, neither one of them ever conceding the point. What he was certain of was the quality of it, direct and honest and without performance, the way she did everything, and the warm smell of sage and the stream in the background, and his hands on her face and her hands holding onto the front of his coat, and the profound, enormous sense of arrival that he had not felt since he was 23 years old and had believed he was home. They did not rush anything after that. She was a woman who had built something carefully and maintained it carefully, and she approached the matters of the heart with the same patience and methodical attention, and he found that her pace suited him, that slowing down after 6 years of movement was not a diminishment but an expansion. He stayed at the homestead. He had a conversation with Ruth that was direct and practical and entirely characteristic of both of them. What he could contribute to the property's operation, what she needed, what he was good at, what she was good at, and where those things overlapped and complemented each other in ways that made the whole stronger than the sum of the parts. It was, Milton thought privately, the most honest negotiation he had ever conducted, and it left him feeling oddly light, as if transparency had a weight he had not known he had been carrying until he set it down. He was good with animals and structures, with the barn, the fences, the water system, the maintenance that a working property constantly required. He was a capable rider and a good shot, which mattered less now that the Prout situation was under official scrutiny, but was not negligible in a territory that was still, in various corners, lawless. He was reliable. He worked hard without needing to be directed in it. What he was not was a beekeeper. That, Ruth made clear, was her domain, and she did not need a partner in it. She needed someone who would respect it and not interfere with it, and who would understand that the hives came first in the morning and last in the evening, and that some of her best thinking happened among the colonies, and that interrupting her thinking time was a liberty she would not tolerate. He understood. He had already observed that her hours among the hives were as productive intellectually as they were practically, and he had no desire to intrude on that. What he did do, over the course of that summer, was learn. He asked questions, and she answered them, patient with his genuine curiosity if not with stupidity, and he absorbed information about Apis mellifera, about the structure of the colonial superorganism, about the queen's role and the workers' roles and the drone's brief and consequential existence, about the extraordinary geometric efficiency of the honeycomb, about the ways a colony communicated through movement, the waggle dance, the round dance, the specific body language through which a scout bee communicated the direction and distance of a flower source, with a precision that Ruth described, quite accurately, as a language. "They have a language," he said one afternoon, watching her conduct an inspection. "A movement language," she said. "The angle of the dance indicates direction relative to the sun. The duration indicates distance. The enthusiasm indicates quality." She held up a frame, sun behind it, the cells glowing. "We communicate in symbols and sound. They communicate in motion and scent. Both are systems for transmitting information between members of a community." "You think about them like a civilization," he said. "I think about them accurately," she said, "which is what a civilization is." He had begun to carry a pocket notebook by midsummer, writing down things she said that seemed to him too good to lose. She discovered this in early August when he left the notebook on the kitchen table, and she opened it by accident and found it half full of her own sentences, transcribed in his precise, slightly angular handwriting. She did not say anything about it directly, but that evening, for the first time, she sat beside him rather than across from him at the dinner table. The shift in geometry was small and enormous simultaneously. In September, a letter came from Cornelius Brand in Albuquerque reporting that Gerald Prout had settled the Territorial Attorney General's inquiry by agreeing to a formal prohibition on any further acquisition activity in the Estancia Valley, to a restitution payment to the families he had coerced, and to a public filing admitting procedural irregularities in the acquisition of the Delgado and Hutchins properties. The Hutchins widow, who had sold at 1/3 market value under duress, was to receive compensation for the difference. The Delgado family, who had left the territory entirely, could not be immediately located, but Brand's office was making efforts. The Ramsey property was explicitly affirmed in the settlement documents as legally sound and unchallenged. Ruth read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning light while Milton made coffee, a role reversal that had happened gradually, as things do when two people begin to organize their lives around each other. And when she put the letter down, she pressed both hands flat on the table for a moment and was very still. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he confirmed, setting her coffee in front of her. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the kind of clarity that comes when something you have been fighting for so long has finally resolved, when you realize that the weight you have been so accustomed to carrying that you had stopped noticing it has been set down, and you will not have to pick it up again. He sat across from her. He thought about what to say and concluded that the moment did not require words, and so he simply looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them was 4 years of her hard work and a summer of shared purpose and the quiet, growing, substantial thing that had been building since the afternoon she had walked out of her house with a shotgun and proved to him that he had been wrong about everything. "I would like," she said, "to make more hives, expand the operation. I have been thinking about direct sales to the railroad hotels in Albuquerque. They need large quantities of honey and beeswax candles, and I could supply both if I had more colonies. How many more? 6 to start. 8 eventually. She picked up her coffee. It will require more woodworking, more frames, more supers, more bottom boards and lids. Thomas built all of our current equipment and I have managed with what he made, but for expansion I would need. I can make them, Milton said. She looked at him. I am not unskilled with wood, he said. Show me what you need and I will build it. She regarded him for a moment with the measuring, precise attention he had come to know as the expression she wore when calculating whether something was true or merely offered. Then she nodded. All right, she said. I will draw you a diagram of the specifications. She drew him 6 diagrams, precise and annotated, with measurements to the fraction of an inch. He built the equipment over the course of October and November, working in the barn on days when the weather permitted, learning from his mistakes, asking for her assessment when he was uncertain, and taking her corrections without defensiveness. The work was satisfying in a way that building things always was: concrete, measurable, the kind of progress you could see. The hive bodies he built were straight and true. Ruth inspected each one and approved them with the quiet thoroughness of an expert, pointing out one instance where his joint was slightly off and would need reinforcement, noting, too, where his workmanship was better than the original equipment Thomas had built. He stored those 2 compliments with the care of a man who has learned that sincere praise from a particular person is more nourishing than any quantity of empty flattery. The winter came on in December, cold and clear, with snow in the mountains and frost in the mornings that made the air taste like iron, and turned the grassland around the homestead into something crystalline and extraordinary. The bees were clustered in their hives, warm and slow, living on stored honey, waiting for spring. The chickens remained productive. Augustine the mule became, in winter, even more determinedly his own creature, with strong opinions about cold weather and less willingness than usual to be cooperative about anything. Milton and Ruth spent the evenings inside, close to the stove, and the winter was long enough and warm enough, in its indoor way, to complete a thing that the summer and fall had been building. They talked their way through everything. Her years with Thomas, his years drifting, the ranch he had lost, her father's hardware business in Pennsylvania that she had never wanted to inherit, the books she loved, the places she had never been and wanted to see, the questions she had about the natural world that the bees had opened up rather than answered. They argued sometimes. She had clear and strongly held opinions about almost everything, and so did he, and their opinions did not always coincide, and neither of them was the kind of person who quietly conceded a point they did not actually concede, and the arguments were mostly productive. He learned things from her positions even when he did not adopt them. He thought she occasionally did the same. By February, he had learned to assist with winter colony checks, entering the hives carefully, and only when Ruth indicated it was appropriate, learning to read the cluster's behavior, learning to distinguish between the sounds of a healthy winter colony and one in distress. He was not yet competent and knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise, but he was learning in the particular way that people learn things from someone who is genuinely expert, from the ground up, with proper foundations, without shortcuts. On a cold, bright Saturday in February of 1883, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the most straightforward way he knew how, which was to wait until they were sitting together after dinner with the stove warm and the night pressed close outside, and to say, without preamble, "Ruth, I would like to marry you. I am asking directly because I think you prefer that, and because I mean it entirely, and because I have never in my life said anything I meant more than I mean this." She looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the winter held the world in its blue and silver grip. "You are staying," she said, not a question. "I am staying. Permanently, not drifting." "You are certain." "I have never been more certain of anything," he said. "This is where I want to be. You are who I want to be with. I'm aware that I arrived here under somewhat ridiculous circumstances, and that the early stages of our acquaintance were complicated by a shotgun. I am suggesting that we continue anyway in a more formal capacity." The corner of her mouth moved. The shotgun was an entirely reasonable precaution under the circumstances. "I agree with you completely." "I am 40 years old," she said. "You are 31. Yes, people will have opinions about that. People will always have opinions. People's opinions are not a reliable guide to one's life." She looked at him. He thought he could see the calculation happening in those gray-green eyes, not a weighing of feeling, because he believed the feeling had been clear for some time, but the specific assessment of a highly intelligent woman determining whether the thing she wanted was also the thing that made sense, whether the practical and the desired were aligned, whether the risk was calculable. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they stayed like that for a while in the warmth of the stove, while the winter continued its business outside. They were married in April in Estancia by the circuit preacher who came through the valley 4 times a year. The Torres family came, all 8 of them, 3 generations, the grandmother wrapped in a black shawl and weeping with the generous, celebratory weeping of a woman who cried at any sufficiently meaningful event, which was most events. Cornelius Brand rode up from Albuquerque and brought a gift, which turned out to be a copy of the formal settlement document from the Prout case, framed, with a note from Brand that read, "For your walls." A reminder that the law can be made to do what it is supposed to do. James Farwell sent a letter of congratulations from Santa Fe. They had a meal at the Torres house after the ceremony, with food that the Torres women had been preparing for 2 days, and that was extraordinary by any standard. And Milton danced with Ruth in the Torres family yard in the April afternoon, with the mountains blue on the horizon, and the smell of the land coming back to life after winter. And he thought that if a man could have only one afternoon in his life, he would choose this one and be grateful. That evening they rode home together to the homestead that was now, formally and completely, their homestead. The hives were already active, spring had come, and the bees were foraging the early-blooming chamisa and the desert willow, and the hum of them carried across the hillside in the evening air. Ruth stood at the top of the hill for a moment and looked at the property below them, the white hives in their rows, the house, the barn, the honey house and wax workshop, Augustine in the corral, Geometry the spotted dog asleep on the porch. And then she looked at Milton and he looked at her. "Thriving," she said quietly. "Thriving," he agreed. The first year of their marriage was busy in the particular way of 2 capable people who have decided to combine their capabilities for mutual amplification rather than mutual limitation. Milton's new hive equipment was populated through splits from Ruth's existing colonies in the spring. A careful process she managed with complete authority, teaching him each step as she went, so that when the new colonies were established and growing, he understood why they had done each thing they had done. By summer they had 19 hives instead of 14, and the honey production that season was 140 pounds more than Ruth's best previous year. He also rebuilt the barn roof that summer, which had been developing a more serious problem than the section he had repaired before, and he replaced the rotted sections of the stock fence on the south and east, and he built a proper woodshed against the north wall of the house so that winter fuel could be stored without taking up space in the barn. These were practical things. He did them without ceremony, in the ordinary course of days, and the ordinary course of days was itself a kind of contentment he had not previously understood was possible. Ruth completed the first contract with one of the railroad hotels in Albuquerque in August. 300 pounds of honey and 40 pounds of processed beeswax, delivered by wagon, which Milton drove while she stayed with the hives, and which netted them more money than the entire previous year's local sales. She negotiated the contract herself, went over every term with Cornelius Brand by mail before signing, and then signed it with the calm certainty of a woman who had always known her product was worth more than the local market had been paying. "You should have done this years ago," Milton said, when he got back from Albuquerque. "I could not have done this years ago," she said. "I did not have the time. I was managing Prout." He saw the truth of that and was newly angry at Gerald Prout for a different reason than any of the previous ones, for the waste of it, for the years of her energy spent on defense rather than growth, for the deliberate throttling of something that deserved to flourish. In the fall, a letter came from Cornelius Brand with an update. The Delgado family had been located, living in Albuquerque where the father had found work at the railroad repair shops. They were to receive their restitution payment from the Prout settlement, which was not enough to buy back their homestead, but was enough to make a material difference in their situation. Brand had also connected them with a legal aid organization working with Hispanic families in the territory, and there were ongoing efforts regarding other properties. Ruth read the letter and then sat with it for a while. "It is not enough," she said, "for the Delgados what they lost." "No," Milton agreed, "it is not enough, but it is something." "It is something," he said, "and Brand is not done." She nodded and filed the letter in the folder where she kept the Prout documentation, which she maintained, even now that the immediate threat was resolved, because she had a clear-eyed understanding that documentation was not only about past events. The winter of 1883-84 was harder than the previous one, with deep cold in January and a week of sustained snow that tested the insulation of every structure on the property. Ruth worried about the hives in the deep cold, and Milton, who had spent 2 years learning what she needed before she said it, packed additional insulation around the most vulnerable colonies without being asked. The bees came through winter intact. In March of 1884, Ruth told him in the morning over coffee, with the directness she brought to everything, that she was pregnant. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for. Not surprise exactly, though it was that, and not just happiness, though it was very much that, something larger than either of those things, something that had to do with the word future and what it meant to have one. "When?" he said. "September, I think," she said. "I have read what I could find on the subject, which is less helpful than I would like. I will need to go to Albuquerque to see a doctor before summer. We will go in May," he said, "when the spring inspection is done." She smiled at him then, the full smile, not the compressed one she used when she was being careful, but the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face, the one he had been working to earn since April, and considered one of the most extraordinary things he had ever been shown. "We," she said. "Always," he said. Their son was born in September of 1884, delivered by a capable midwife from Estancia who arrived in time to be useful. Ruth labored with the same focused, determined efficiency she brought to everything, and Milton was present throughout, because she asked him to be, and because he could not have been anywhere else if he had wanted to. The baby arrived at dawn, loud and certain of his importance, with Milton's dark coloring and Ruth's eyes, and, as Ruth said, reviewing him with the calm attention of a scientist examining a new specimen, apparent good health and vigorous lungs. They named him Thomas Milton Slater, which was Ruth's suggestion, and which Milton accepted with a fullness of feeling he could not quite speak aloud. Thomas, who was called Tommy to distinguish him from the memory he was named for, and who grew to have strong opinions about this, and would eventually insist on the full name, was from the beginning fascinated by the bees. Ruth took him to the hives in a sling when he was 3 months old, and he was calm among them in the same inexplicable way his mother was calm, which Ruth observed with scientific interest, and Milton observed with the overwhelmed tenderness of a man who keeps discovering that the world has arranged things more beautifully than he deserved. The business grew. By 1886, they had 26 hives and 2 railroad hotel contracts in Albuquerque, a contract with a candle maker in Santa Fe, and a small but reliable mail-order business that Ruth had organized with characteristic precision, using the postal system to reach customers as far away as Denver and Kansas City. She had written a short monograph on beekeeping in arid climates that was published in a naturalist's journal out of St. Louis, a fact she mentioned to Milton, with a deliberate casualness that did not at all conceal how much it mattered to her. He read the monograph 3 times and bought 12 copies through the journal's address to send to people whose respect meant something. In 1887, a woman from the university in Las Cruces who was studying native pollinator populations in the territory came to the homestead and spent a week interviewing Ruth and observing her methods. Ruth spent 3 hours of that first day telling the woman everything she knew, and Milton served them both coffee at the kitchen table and listened with the quiet pride of a man who has known for years that the person he loves is remarkable, and who is still, reliably, surprised by the specific ways in which that remarkability continues to manifest. Their second child, a daughter, named Eliza after Ruth's middle name, arrived in 1888, when Tommy was 4 and already developing his own small areas of expertise, including the conviction that he personally was responsible for the well-being of Geometry the spotted dog, who was elderly by then but still determinedly present. Eliza came into the world with the serene confidence of a second child, and from her earliest weeks had an expression of patient evaluation that was so specifically her mother's that Milton sometimes looked at her and laughed for the pure pleasure of it. The Estancia Valley continued to change around them. The railroad came through in 1885, and the valley experienced the particular upheaval that railroad access brought to a frontier community growth, new businesses, new people, disputes about land and water that were now, thanks in part to the precedent set by the Prout settlement, slightly more likely to be resolved through legal channels than through intimidation. The Torres family remained on their land. Estancia grew to a town of nearly 1,000 people. A proper school opened, which mattered when Tommy was 6 and Ruth's position on education thorough, rigorous, non-negotiable, met the practical reality that there was now somewhere to send a 6-year-old that met her standards. Gerald Prout, as far as anyone knew, retreated to his Santa Fe office and confined his acquisition activities to the northern part of the territory, away from the Estancia Valley and the official scrutiny that still, technically, attached to his previous activities there. He was not spoken of often in their household. Ruth had filed her papers and won her case and moved forward, which was her nature, and Milton had no interest in dwelling on a man who had become, from a threat requiring serious management, merely a historical fact. In 1890, Ruth was approached by a newly formed agricultural organization in the territory about presenting her methods at a conference in Albuquerque. She accepted, prepared her presentation with her characteristic combination of perfectionism and systematic confidence, and delivered it to an audience of farmers, ranchers, territorial officials, and 2 professors from back east to a response that was, as Milton described it in a letter to James Farwell afterward, nothing short of astonishing. She received questions for 45 minutes after her presentation ended, and she answered every one of them with the precise, deep knowledge of a person who had spent 12 years doing this work in the actual land, rather than reading about it in books. One of the professors from back east asked her, with only slightly concealed condescension, how she had come to know so much about colonial insect social structures without formal scientific training, and Ruth looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said, "Through sustained direct observation over an extended period, which is, I believe, the methodological foundation of scientific inquiry." The audience laughed. The professor from back east had the grace to look slightly ashamed. Milton, sitting in the 3rd row, felt something in his chest that was by now familiar but never less than remarkable. The specific happiness of watching the person you love be entirely, completely themselves, without apology or performance, in the full exercise of what they are. He caught her eye as she gathered her papers at the end, and she gave him the full smile, the real one, and he gave it back. And around them the conference room buzzed with the sound of people wanting to talk to Ruth Ramsey Slater, and neither of them moved toward each other through the crowd because they did not need to. They were, in every sense that counted, already precisely where they were supposed to be. Tommy was 6 that year and had recently decided, with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old who has received confirmation from the most authoritative source available, that he wanted to be a naturalist when he grew up. The most authoritative source was his mother, who had confirmed that this was a reasonable aspiration, and had then given him a small notebook and told him to begin observing and recording, because all naturalists observed and recorded. Tommy's first notebook contained 17 observations about geometry, the spotted dog's sleeping habits, 4 observations about Augustine the mule's behavior during thunderstorms, 2 pages of detailed observation about a colony of ants he had found near the root cellar, and a drawing of a bee that was anatomically ambitious, if not entirely accurate. Ruth reviewed the notebook with the same attention she brought to her own records and pronounced it a strong beginning with areas for development, which was, for Tommy, equivalent to the highest praise in the world. Eliza, 2 years old and possessed of the serene certainty of a person who has already figured out the most important things, was at this point primarily interested in the bees from the perspective of the honey they produced, and had strong opinions about which variety of honeycomb was most suitable for direct consumption. In 1891, Milton built a second honey house, larger than the first, to accommodate expanded extraction capacity, and constructed 2 additional rooms on the main house, one of which became the library, because Ruth's collection of books had outgrown the existing shelves, and because Milton had decided privately that a woman who read and thought the way she did deserved a room built specifically to honor that. He paneled it in pine and built the shelves himself, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and installed a window that faced south and east and caught the morning light. He finished it in a week when she was in Albuquerque for a meeting with her Albuquerque hotel clients, and she came home to find it complete. She walked into the room and stood in the center of it for a long time. He stood in the doorway and watched her look at the shelves and the window and the morning light, and he watched the thing that happened in her face, and it was better than anything. "Milton," she said. "You needed space," he said, "for the books and for the thinking." She turned to look at him. 12 years before, she had held a shotgun on a man she did not know who had walked into her house uninvited. She had been surviving on her own for 2 years by then, managing a grief and a homestead and a threat simultaneously, with the fierce, complete self-reliance of a woman who had decided that survival was not negotiable. And here she was now, in the room he had built for her, in the house that was theirs, on the land that was affirmed and protected and growing, with their children in the next room and the bees on the hillside and the mountains on the horizon. She crossed the room and put her hands on his face and kissed him with the fullness and directness that she brought to everything, and he held her in the doorway of the room he had built. And outside the morning was happening over the Manzano Mountains, all light and space and the hum of the bees on the hillside, doing their extraordinary, ordinary, essential work. Geometry, the spotted dog, died peacefully that autumn, at a very old age, and was buried under the piñon tree at the north edge of the property, with a marker that Tommy made himself from a flat piece of sandstone on which he chiseled the dog's name with careful, crooked letters. The whole family attended this ceremony with appropriate gravity. Even Eliza, 3 years old, understood that it was a serious occasion, and stood with her hands clasped in front of her, brow slightly furrowed, in an expression that was so precisely Ruth's that Milton had to look at the mountains to keep from smiling at the wrong moment. In 1892, a second son arrived. They named him James, after James Farwell, who had been the first official to take their situation seriously. James Farwell himself, now retired from the land office and living with his daughter's family in Santa Fe, received a letter informing him of this honor and wrote back with evident pleasure that he hoped the name brought the boy good fortune, and that he was proud to be associated with a family that had done things right. James Slater was a boisterous, physical, cheerful child who showed early signs of his father's relationship to practical work. He wanted to fix things, to build things, to understand how things were constructed and what would happen if you changed them. He was also a child of considerable determination, which was a genetic inheritance that gave both his parents a specific and knowing look when it manifested, because they each recognized it from a different source and had to acknowledge that it came from both directions simultaneously. Tommy, by now 8 years old, took his responsibilities as the eldest seriously and with genuine warmth, showing James the ants near the root cellar and the proper way to approach the hives, which Ruth was beginning to teach him formally, because he had the temperament for it, and recording his baby brother's developmental stages in his notebook with the earnest precision of a young naturalist. The homestead in 1893 looked considerably different from the homestead that Milton Slater had entered in the summer of 1882, thinking it was empty. The buildings were in better repair, added to, maintained with the ongoing attention of people who intended to be there for a very long time. There were now 31 hives on the south slope, their white-weathered boxes a permanent feature of the hillside. There was a proper vegetable garden, irrigated from the spring system that Milton had extended and improved over the years. There was a new fence around the whole of the usable property, post and rail, straight and well built. There was a rope swing on the old cottonwood near the barn, put there by Milton for Tommy, and now providing entertainment for all 3 children, and, on one memorable occasion, for Ruth herself, while Milton watched from the porch and laughed. On a September evening in 1893, 11 years after a dusty, broke drifter had walked through an unlocked door into what he thought was an empty homestead, Milton and Ruth sat on the porch in the cooling air after the children were asleep. The mountains were purple dark against a sky going from orange to deep blue, the colors spreading horizontally like something being poured. The bees were quiet in their hives. The stock were settled in the barn. The land spread out around them in the evening silence, occupied and warm and known. Ruth had a cup of tea. He had coffee, which she claimed was a poor choice in the evening, but which she had stopped arguing about 2 years ago on the grounds that he was going to drink it regardless. She was reading. She almost always had a book within reach, and he was reviewing a brief letter from Cornelius Brand about an unrelated property matter in the valley. Nothing threatening, simply an update. Brand says the valley land prices have increased 40% in the last 5 years, Milton said. Partly railroad access, partly water management improvements. Partly, said Ruth without looking up from her book, a reduction in predatory acquisition activity. Partly that, he agreed. She turned a page. Tommy asked me today if he could start a colony of his own, she said. His own hive, his own responsibility. He wants to sell honey at the estancia market independently. He is 9. He is sufficiently competent, she said. I have been watching him for 2 years. His technique is good and his instincts are better. He is calm among them. She glanced at Milton over the top of her book. It is hereditary, apparently. Your heredity, not mine. I still treat them with considerable respect. Respect is correct, she said. Fear would be wrong. You have the balance right. She returned to her book. I told him yes. He can start with a split from the Thomas hive in the spring. He will be very pleased. He was very pleased. He wrote 4 pages of notes in his notebook immediately after the conversation. Milton thought about his oldest son, 9 years old and already a miniature naturalist with ink-stained fingers and a series of increasingly sophisticated observation notebooks, and felt the complicated warmth that fatherhood had turned out to be, not something he had fully expected before it arrived, to be so specifically and continuously wonderful. Eliza wants to know when she can have a colony too, Ruth said. I told her when she stops trying to eat the honeycomb directly from the frame without being invited. That seems fair. She found it somewhat less than fair. Milton set down Brand's letter and looked out at the mountains going dark against the last of the light. The evening star had appeared. In a few months, it would be the 12th anniversary of the afternoon he had knocked on a door and gotten no answer, and made a decision that had turned out to be one of the more consequential decisions of his life, though not in any direction he could have predicted. He thought about Gerald Prout, occasionally, in the way you thought about a storm that had threatened to do damage and been navigated around with residual awareness, but not with any ongoing concern. He thought about the Delgados and the Hutchins widow, who had both, in the years since the settlement, found their ways back to some degree of stability, though not to the exact lives they had been building before Prout interrupted them. He thought about those injustices, and about the ongoing project of trying to be a person who made things better rather than worse in the part of the world where he happened to find himself. He thought about 6 years of drifting and what had finally stopped him. A woman with a shotgun and gray-green eyes and 14 hives of bees and an absolute refusal to be removed from what she had built. Ruth, he said. She looked up from her book because he had said her name in the particular way that indicated something worth attending to. Thank you, he said. She tilted her head slightly, the small interrogative gesture he knew so well. For what specifically? For stepping out, he said. That afternoon. She looked at him for a moment, and then she understood what he meant, and something moved through her face that was 12 years of everything, the fear and the determination and the long, careful work of building something real, and the unexpected arrival of the man who had turned out to be worth the risk of loving, all of it moving through her expression in a single moment, clear and honest and completely hers. I had no intention, she said, of staying inside. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat together on the porch in the fall evening while the stars came out one by one over the Manzano Mountains, and the land was quiet around them, and the bees were dreaming in their hives whatever it is that bees dream, and the homestead held them both, occupied and warm and entire, everything resolved, everything found, everything exactly where it was supposed to be.